Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to a video, and today we're going to be doing a 6S build. Now all the parts that I have listed out here, I did a separate video sort of going over them in a little bit more depth and sort of explaining the reason for going 6S low KV on a racing setup like this, and there'll be a link down in the description to that video if you haven't seen it. So let's get right into the build. First up, I'm just going to take the top plate and the TPU mounts off since they're going to be in the way, and I just had those on to show the frame. This is the Mode 2 Ghost Special Edition, by the way. Alright, so there we go, that's off. So I like to mount my motors first. So we have our Hyperlite 2207 1722 kV motors here. Just come with their own screws and lock nut in a little bag. And these screws are the 2.5 millimeter hex head, the larger one, and I just use a little bit of blue Loctite. This is some Hobby King Loctite. Little drop on the end, don't need a lot. And we can mount our motors here. Very straightforward. Make sure you keep them loose until you get all four in there. However, since these are 16 by 16, the base of the motor, you're not going to have any problem lining up the bearing in the middle, because there's only can go in the middle. And just real quick, making sure, yep, that's in the middle, and then these screws don't come up too far, but if you're using 4mm arms, it's fine. I do believe these are 7mm screws, so that's nice. They just barely come up to the top of the base. Hopefully you can see. And you can just tighten them down decently. You don't need to go crazy. You have the Loctite on there, as well as, since I use 4 screws, you don't need to go super crazy. I just don't like to, because a lot of times I have one fall out. So there we go. That motor is on there, everything's spinning smooth. And then just so I don't lose it, I'm going to put the little sort of prop washer nut thing on there, and then the actual prop nut, and just sort of quickly hand tighten it, just so I don't lose, since I've lost a couple of those before. So let me do the other 3 motors. Alright, there we go. All 4 motors are installed on the arms, right there. So pretty much next, I usually go about getting the 4-in-1 ESC ready to go in the middle stack here. However, I do mount my receiver underneath that, so I'm going to prepare that first. So I'm just using a FreeSky X4 RSB. It's been the most reliable receiver for me, so I want to bind this guy first before I put it, heat shrink it and put it underneath there. So I pretty much just have a old flight controller hooked up just to give 5 volts out to power the receiver on, just so we can bind it before we put it in anything. So really all I'm doing here is hooking up 5 volts in ground from the old flight controller to the receiver. That way I can get it bound without having it a hassle of being inside the build. So the 5 volt and ground are just these 2 pads on the front row, right next to the white connector. Those 2 pads there, 5 volts closer to the white connector, and S bus is right next to that, but for now we don't need that. So we can just real quick connect that up. Looks good. Alright, and then we can go ahead and get our radio out and ready in bind mode. Make sure everything is all good. I'm just going to press and hold the button. Where's that lays up here while I plug in. Right there. Got the solid green flashing red. So we're good. We can just unplug everything. Exit bind mode. Plug back in, and you can see we have the solid green. Everything went well. I'm going to set my throttle all the way to the bottom on my remote here, and then just give the bind button just a quick press. Right there you can see the green light flashes to set the extra failsafe on the receiver, and then of course there is one put in by the flight controller, but that I just do that to be extra safe. So we can unplug this, disconnect that, and heat shrink the receiver. Alright. Have the receiver all bound up, and I just added the wires on. We have our S bus, which is the yellow, 5 volts, the red, and ground, and I ran them back this way, since if this is the back of the frame right here, I prefer to have the receiver with the antennas facing that way, because I actually run them around as well, sort of bend them like that, just sort of take up a little bit of extra slack since I put them right here out the arms. And then this, these leads can come out the front, up right here into the flight controller, since the S-bus pads are on the front, they can come up and solder right to that. So, I'm going to get this guy heat shrunk. Clear heat shrink, and this stuff is 3/4 inch. Fits receivers pretty well. Right, there we go. I actually popped those guys back off, and I'm just going to run them straight so the antennas don't have to bend, and then these wires can just fit in between them, sort of. And if you were going to be running smart port, you'd get the pin out from this connector, one of those. I'm not exactly sure which one. However, I'm not interested in that, so I'm just going to heat shrink it as is. And it does look like this one is conformal coated from the factory. However, I always just put a little bit of heat shrink. Helps keep it from shorting on stuff, as well as little capacitors and electronic bits from getting knocked off the bottom from scraping around. Take a heat gun and start shrinking this. Flip it over and hit the other side. There we go, and then you can sort of just pinch off the ends to sort of seal the heat shrink. Careful, it's still pretty hot. There we go, receiver is ready, and you can pretty much just sort of set it down in there for now, because we need to build the stack. Start building the stack with the nylon spacers to hold the ESC. And off camera I did readjust these battery wires, because with the special edition Ghost, these standoffs are in the middle, so you can't have your battery lead come out the back straight like that between them like I normally do. So I had to sort of put them out to the side on this Aikon ESC. Now they do want you to run it out the left like this. However, I do not like battery leads coming out the side, so I'm going to run it like this, and then just remap the motors to the correct one since they'll be out of order. And that'll just sit there like that, just fine, around this little UFL, and then probably have to put the XC60 right here, which should be alright. Not the cleanest, I'm not exactly happy with that. That is one downside of having this guy here, although you could raise this up and then put your leads through it and then just not run it all the way down, but I like how clean it looks at the bottom, so we're just going to go with that. So let me put in some nylon spacers for the stack. Alright, I sort of have the stack figured out. Definitely not how I'd like it with everything, but it's just because I'm really running out of these little nylon standoffs, but I made it work. So basically you just have the ESC there, and then the receiver, I just put it under there, and this can float freely, so I'm not going to secure that down. There's really no need. Once the battery strap's across here, since that's where the strap runs, it just sits in there. You can double-side sticky tape it, but I don't have any problems with it like that. So next we can pretty much start to clean up these extremely long motor wires here, just routing them inwards. Let's zoom in just a little bit. So basically, if they come along the arm here, I like to have them come up to here and then sort of run around into the ESC from the inside like this. It keeps them nice and straight. Looks very, very clean. You can just run them one-to-one and then change them in the computer software. So I'm going to leave just a little bit of extra slack, just trying to size it up to get a little bit more than you need, since it's always easier to cut off a little bit of extra wire than it is to extend them. So I'm just going to make the cut there, but I'm going to move it just a little bit, make them just a tad longer. We have nice spare wires that you can keep in case you need anything later. And then of course these are just real nice silicone wires, so you can just strip and tin these guys. And if possible, when tinning, try to keep them not directly over the electronics, in case some of these solder splatters just a little bit, so it doesn't short anything out. Alright, and since this standoff is kind of in the way, I'm going to remove it just for now, especially so I don't hit it with my soldering iron and melt that. So we can take our far left wire, which is going to be routed to the inside pad right here, and you do want to make sure that you leave enough room for the standoff there, but this way especially you can get your pliers in there to hold it down nice and firm. There we go, and then I'm going to push it down, make sure it sits all the way down against the pad, although that will not fit because of standoff, so I'm going to have to readjust it just a little bit. There we go, that's a real nice joint, and let's see if this fits back on. Yep, that fits back there, so let's do the other two. Okay, and then getting the last one. Sort of just tacking it in place, readjusting the pliers, then making sure you get all the way down nice against the pad as far down as it can go, since the fets are in the way just a little bit. Then we can sort of straighten the wires back out, and that looks pretty nice and clean there. Not absolutely perfect joints, but definitely pretty good, definitely acceptable. So there was one. I'm going to go ahead and do the other three off camera. No sense in showing you them. However, for the other rack one does the same exact way. However, for the front ones, I do wire them sort of like this down along the arm. I don't go under the camera because that just kind of makes a mess. So I zip tie them right here along the arm, and then they come into this space. They come up over that and then wire kind of like that. So they kind of just span across that space, and the battery strap runs under them right there. That's the cleanest way I've found, and it leaves it real open and easy for repairs. So let me do the other three. Alright, there we have all the ESCs and the 4-in-1 wired up, and I did go ahead and repin the little wire harness that came with the Hyperlite F4 flight controller, and this will be getting shorter in the next version, so it's a little bit long right now, but I'm not going to shorten it. I'm just going to stuff it in there. And the wiring was wrong for the ESC because its first version everything was kind of mixed up, so it will be fixed for the second version. You won't have to do this. However, they give you a little warning with it if you got the first batch on how to fix it, which is really straightforward to follow. But since we also did turn the ESC 90 degrees, that screws up the outputs, and you can do resource mapping to shuffle that around in the flight controller. But I prefer to just depin it while I'm at it, since we already had to repin for the current and voltage through here. So the side that plugs into the flight controller, if you have the first version, just stays the same. You don't have to mess with that. And then on the side of the connector, we have the purple, then we have yellow, we have brown, blue, white, then there's a gap. There is no pin in that one right there, so you have a gap, and then you have red, black, and then the last one is a gap as well. And this puts the ESC telemetry and the current sensor and the current data to the flight controller in the right spots, as well as VBAT for the flight controller on this line. And then I shuffled all the signals around to make them line up. So hopefully that's the correct order. I'll find out real quick when I'm testing it if it's not. But other than that, for the flight controller, pretty much that's all we have to do to wire that up. There we go. So that's really nice, and we can pretty much just leave that off for now. And I also did go ahead and put some zip ties on the front. I didn't do the back yet, since we're going to be adding the LEDs and then strapping the receiver antennas. We'll get here. The receiver antennas will go out along the arms here, so I'm not going to do those just yet. So let's actually start to install these little tiny tie LEDs on the arms here, which will then strap these down. And pretty much how I like to do it is by having the zip tie wrap around here, and I apologize, this one is super beat up and in need of repair, but the zip tie basically just goes around, and then I double side sticky tape the LED to the arm and sort of zip tie over the wires here, and then they just run into the main battery leads. So I do that on both sides. Do that, pretty much just get the zip ties for the outer part done quick to help hold the wires nice and straight and in place and keep them out of the way. Prop strikes you can use heat shrink all the way down along the arm. However, I find with the rate that you crash during racing, that can not only hide delaminations in the arm, as well as with the rate that you have to change them during crashing and racing, I find it easier just to use zip ties. So before we put that next one on, we can get the little LED chip ready. You can pretty much just grab any wire at all, as long as it's pretty thin. I tend to use the extra spares that came with sort of the camera connectors there. It doesn't need to carry any current really, so the smallest wire you have will work just fine. And for the LED, I already sort of pre-tinned it, but let me just touch it up again. And you don't need that much heat for these, using about 340 degrees Celsius here. All flows pretty nice right there. And now these ones are orange. These ones are actually reverse polarity. I'm not exactly sure the reason why, but these ones are. They won't blow up if you plug them in backwards, which is really nice, but that's why I'm going to be wiring the black wire to the positive pad here, so that when I connect it up, we can just do it like normal on the other end, so we don't get confused. But yeah, this LED is reverse polarity, so that's why. So then I just kind of pinch the end and give the wires a little twist there. And then we can take some double-sided sticky tape and cut off a little section for it. Does not need to be very big. And stick it to the back of the LED, and there are kind of like through holes, sort of. I'm not sure if this would short if you just stick it right on there and zip tie it. However, you don't want to cover up the LEDs, so I find just a little bit of sticky tape, just like that, works perfectly fine. Alright, there we have that. So I'm just going to stick the LED down right there and just press it firmly against the arm, just like that, right behind the other zip tie, and then can sort of just take the wires for now and just kind of run them up, because we will have to solder them to the battery pad, just like that. Then I'm going to take a thicker zip tie around to hold the antenna in place. I use a thicker one so it's a little stiffer, more durable. Hold the antennas out there, and sort of just going to wrap around the motor wires as well as the little LED. You don't want to go too tight here. Hopefully you can see that I'm not really pinching any the LED here. I'm just kind of going around the wires to keep that in place. And the pads are a little exposed on the bottom there, but I've flown this in snow with the same setup with zero problems there. But you could add some conformal coating or electrical tape, liquid electrical tape over that if you wanted. There we go. So just tightened up that zip tie. Doesn't need to be super tight. And then the antenna will come about out to halfway, so I'm just going to cut this off just so it's not super annoying. Just cut it plenty long for now. And there we go. That's how I mount the LEDs, and then we'll use that antenna later for the receiver antenna. So let me go ahead and wire this up as well as do the other one on the other side. And then the LED connections, just really simple, go off of the main battery pads here. However, these ones are made for 4S, and this will be a 6S quad. So we'll have to see if they blow up or not. If they do, I can get the specific 6S versions, but we're going to try these 4S ones, so let me do that. Alright, so there we go. I got the LEDs wired up. Hopefully you can see, like I was explaining before, just sort of wrapped underneath the arms, and then the wires just come up around the side onto the main battery pads. Just tack them on top there. I also did install the antenna while I was at it, since it's going to be hard to get in there. I kind of gave the little pigtail a little bend to come up through there, and then it's going to plug onto the Unify right about here. I went ahead and put the heat shrink on the antennas. You can see they run down along there just while I was at it, as well as I did add an XT60 coming out the back. And once again, really not a fan of this sort of setup, having to do it like this, no stress relief, having to come around this mount. But that's the way the special edition kind of works, unless you wanted to have it come out the side, which I did not. So for the flight controller, we already are done wiring up the ESC, if we have this cable done already. So really, all we have to do is get the camera and VTX wired up to the flight controller and their power sources respectively. Then everything should just stick together and be done. And then we can put the top plate on. So for the camera, just gives you this normal connector here. That's the wrong side. This is the camera side right here. Just plugs in. You have your 5 to 36 volts VCC all the way on the left. You have ground, video, OSD, and menu. So these two cables are for the control through the OSD. I'm going to be doing a lot of this soldering off camera and then sort of just go over what I did. But if you take a look at the flight controller on the back, things are written out. You can hopefully see the connections down here that we're going to need is video, and this is from the VTX into the flight controller. We have our VBAT and ground to power the flight controller. And then you have your TX5 right here for your smart audio, if you're going to be using that. And then over on the other side is where we have our oh, it's upside down, the camera connections. If we look up here, we have cam S. This is camera signal, so it's the video in from the camera. 5-volt and ground to power it if you want to do that, or you can run it off VBAT from somewhere else. Here we have cam C. This is camera control. Since it does have the resistor built in, you can actually change the settings of the camera from your flight controller, from your OSD, without even having to use this cable. And I'm pretty sure all you have to do is wire up this white wire from the OSD cable onto that. However, it might not fit. I'll have to see if I can get that on there. If not, I probably won't use it because I never change the settings, but it is a really cool feature. And then over here we have our S-Bus 5-volt and ground, which is the other 3 wires we left on this little cable hanging out. Then you have your telemetry and RX4, which I assume is for your smart port pads if you were using those. So that's pretty much all the connections on the back. It just shows you in writing. It also is on the front, but it's harder to see. And then this side has the nice big pads, through-hole pads to solder to. And so for the way I'm going to be installing this, I'm actually going to solder everything to the top here with all the chips on it. Then I'm going to flip it over onto the stack. That way we have the flat side up, and then the VTX will just sticky tape to the top of that, and that should fit well in there. That way it also makes it a lot easier for repairs if the whole board can just flip off and open up everything, all the connections there. So, like I said, a lot of this is going to be done off camera because it's just going to be small, fiddly little wiring work, but I'll go over once again where I wired everything. So, let's cut to that. Alright, so there we have pretty much everything wired up here. Obviously, I didn't quite finish the entire stack yet, but let me just real quick show you what I actually did for the wiring. Same thing I just went over, but now with actual wires. So here we have the VTX on top. Just kind of fold that back for now. Flight controller, flip this guy over. So over here, obviously, we do have the ESC connector, so that just plugs right in. Up front, I just soldered the receiver wires, the 5-volt ground and S-Bus, those 3 there. Up front is the camera connector with our video, 5-volt ground, and then the camera control off the OSD. And I did solder both ground wires to the single ground pad. Since the connector has 2 ground wires, I just simply did that. And then for the VTX, we just have our video, our VBAT, and our ground, and then our smart audio on TX5 there. And that's pretty much it. Just kind of have to fit everything back together again, as well as we need to take this UFL SMA off and put the AXI UFL on there. However, since this is kind of gonna need to sit like this, and it's gonna have a little bit of strain on it, I'm actually gonna pop that off, and then when I put it on, I'm gonna solder the ground or the edge to the VTX itself so it can't move. So I'll show that. But real quick, let me put this stack of mess back together. Alright, there we go. We have the flight controller stuck back on. Everything's sort of fitted together again. And I am going to, since I'm going to solder on the UFL, I'm going to add some solder to the ground here before we stick the VTX to the flight controller here, because I don't want to damage the flight controller. And it might be a little bit hard to get some solder in there. So let's just do that right now. So this big gold part on the end of the ESC, or the VTX here, is the ground, so you can just solder that. And the outside of the UFL, this gold part, is just the ground as well. So you can just connect those together to give the actual connector itself some stress relief. There you go, so just kind of heat that up. Got a little bit of solder on the end, so now we can roughly size up some sticky tape for the VTX. Probably somewhere like that. Just stick it to the back of the VTX here. Peel the backing off, and then we can stick it down pretty much somewhere right about in the middle, right there, and that holds it really, really solid. Then we can go ahead and plug in the VTX cable we had wired up right there. And now we can go ahead and try and get this little UFL soldered on. And there we go, I popped it in place. So now we can add some solder to the outside of the connector here and get that to flow with the bottom part of the VTX. Just sort of connect it all around. There we go. Hopefully you can see that there. So we're just connected it to that bottom part, and that should, yep, that's really solid. It should give pretty decent stress relief to the pigtail since we have it mounted in this really awkward manner. I do know that this is not ideal for video. You don't want a sharp bend like that, but it's about the best I can come up with at this point. It's a little too late now. There we go. So I just pushed it down just a little bit more to keep it kind of flat, and that should be pretty solid. I mean, it's not the best setup, but it's never really going to get hit like that, and the antenna should be perfectly fine. So that looks pretty good. Now we can get the camera mounted lastly here. Just the stock TPU mounts, just using some of the screws that came with the camera here. Screw just goes into the camera, and sort of you can tighten these guys up pretty well. It'll squish a TPU, but you don't want it to be moving a lot. And make sure you mount it backwards so that when it fits in, it is pretty well protected behind the top plate. Just go ahead and get the other one there. And then we can plug the connector in right there and squish it down. Make sure the connector's out of the way. Move the wires just a bit. Push that guy down, and there we go. That's a nice about 50 or 60 degree angle there, and then the top plate should have just enough room over the VTX. Yep, just enough room there, and this camera can go down a little bit more depending on the angle to give it a little bit more protection against the front there. So you can see that's pretty well protected in there, and it shouldn't have any standoffs in view. There we go. So let me just go back, recheck everything, sort of tidy up just a little bit. There's not really anything else to do besides these screws, but we'll be back when I'm done with that. Alright, there we go, all finished up, looking really nice and clean. As for the special edition frame, I'm not 100% sure if I like it, if I'm going to use it again. You know, I just don't, with the VTX antenna coming out the back here, it really blocks the whole back, which I usually use to stick my battery leads, antenna, and just the capacitor and other stuff. I did forget to use the capacitor that came with the ESC. However, it's only a 330 microfarad, so it probably wouldn't have helped much if it did help at all. Hopefully it'll be alright, because this ESC does have a lot of little caps all along it there, more than usual. But let's do a first fateful plug-in. I'm going to check with a multimeter first, and I left the props off before I did this because last time people were yelling at me. Can't always get yelled at. So we're good with the continuity test. Let's just plug in with a 4S first with a little smoke stopper on it here. Let's see what happens. Hey, there we go. All good. It didn't fully boot up. That's probably just an ESC setting, so we're good there. You can see the LEDs on the back are kicking it. They are very bright, nice orange color, and you'll be able to see them when you're someone's coming up behind you. Hopefully, they're not coming up behind you, but makes your quad way more visible for racing, so it's a really nice touch. So let's now switch to the 6S battery. Use a smoke stopper once again, just in case. And let's see what happens. And once again, these LEDs are not rated for 6S. They're only rated for 4S. So, oops. Alright, everything plugs up. A little more aggressive, powerful tone, a little higher pitch, it sounded like, from the extra voltage. LEDs are on, very, very bright, a little bit brighter than the 4S. And wow, they are getting hot really quick. So yeah, definitely wouldn't recommend using the 4S version of these for 6S. He does make a special 6S version, but I didn't have any, so hopefully they won't completely melt themselves. So let's get some props on and get a weight. Putting on the GemFan 5055 Hulkies. Got some clear blue ones here. Since we have blue and orange kind of theme, blue flight controller, blue frame, blue and orange motors. Should have got blue and orange wires. Oops. So let's just get these on and make sure with these motors that you take these little spacers off, and then you put the prop on right there, then the spacer, and then the little lock nut, and that will hold everything down really nice and tight. Alright, there we go. So we can get the scales ready, and this guy does look really nice with these Hulky props, everything. I'm really liking the way this build looks. So let's try and guess the weight here before we actually put it on the scale. So the frame, I believe, with this mount is about 60 grams. Lighter VTX antenna, heavy props, light motors, sort of heavy electronics overall. I'm going to guess probably somewhere around 293. This is without a battery strap, so 293 is my guess. Let me just get the battery strap up and put it down. 278. Wow, that's actually a little bit better than I was expecting. I guess those motors being probably 2 or 3 grams lighter on each side really does help. So 278, and then we can add our battery strap. Comes in about to 285 here. So yeah, that's a really nice weight for some 2207 motors that are going to be running on 6S with these props. So I'm really looking forward to this build getting into the flight testing. Hopefully be doing line of sight as soon as I can this weekend, assuming that this video came out on Friday. So yeah, that's going to bring us to the end of the build video. Hopefully you found it entertaining or informational to watch. I apologize for not showing all the soldering. It just gets kind of hard to do all on camera. So there'll be links down in the description to all the parts below with the motors, frame, flight controller, LEDs, everything down below. Yeah, really liking this build. Really excited to try out 6S. I'll also put a link to the sort of parts overview video that I did. If you're interested in a little bit more of the specs on the components here, I split that up into a separate video, so that'll be in the description as well. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.